Everyone, welcome to Armbars and Sidebars. Today we are joined by a promoter and producer who has been seen in a variety of promotions and programs, including the NWA, NWA affiliates, but perhaps he's best notable and most notable for running the United Wrestling Network, Championship Wrestling. David Marquez, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
I really wanted to have this interview. You kept coming up. I talked to Joe Galley. I talked to Johnny LaQuasto. I talked to Captain Yuma. I talked to Todd Kenley. It was like your name would come up. You and Adam Pearce tend to be the two names that came up the most.
That makes sense.
And you have a lot of influence, and you've done a ridiculous amount, way more than I even realized. I've known your work for, I don't know, maybe a decade, maybe a little more, from Championship Wrestling from Hollywood, and then later the NWA, Primetime, all that. But I didn't know the extent of it. I'm very excited to talk to you. Before we get into the official interview, where can people find you? What should people be checking out?
Well, I mean, our websites aren't always up to speed. At HollywoodWrestling.com, and I think it's Hollywood or UnitedWrestlingTV.com. My company's website is DavidMarquezProd.com, which is probably also not updated. But Facebook mostly, social media at CWF Hollywood, or if you are a glutton and you really want to follow me, it's at CWFH Marquez on Instagram and on Twitter, and I use those for business purposes, but it's also my personal stuff. So the human David Marquez is on there too. So if you have thoughts on politics or whatnot, it may not agree with what I stand for and think of. So just be warned before you go there.
Yeah, and we'll have links in the description of every video that links to your personals and Championship Wrestling, so people can check you out and anything up and coming. Is there a big upcoming show that I know you're at a show right now. For those of you who are watching, this is quite obvious. Those of you listening, maybe not. He's in front of the ring right now at a taping. Is there any big show coming up that you'd like to plug? We're normally a few weeks behind, but...
Well, I mean, every month we're here at the Irvine Improv, where we are now at the Irvine Spectrum in Irvine, California. That's in Orange County, probably about, I'd say, 15 minutes south of Disneyland. And this is where we shoot Championship Wrestling presented by Car Shield every month. And the program is syndicated to about 180 stations all over the country. And it's also available on Fight and YouTube. We have a brand new broadcast starting in Louisville, Kentucky, on My 58, the My Network station there. And I believe our first event is March 26th. And I don't know the Derby City handles off the top of my head. But because they're brand new, I think we just made them this week. And that's in conjunction with the Fox station there. And this is their sister station, the My Network station. And really looking forward to that. But like every show is a big show. Every show is a big event. So it's television. It might not be Raw, SmackDown, or Dynamite, but to me, it's just the same.
No, absolutely. And we'll definitely get into that because I find your mindset very interesting from what I've gathered about the approach you want to take and the approach you have taken. And I definitely want to dive more into that. But I'd like to start just way from the beginning. First and foremost, before we even get into the wrestling talk, because that's going to be obviously the focus, what has been your gigs away from wrestling? Because I was looking up some stuff, and I know you worked with Disney and you have a production company. Can you guide us through your various careers, outside of wrestling first?
Sure. I mean, I originally wanted to be an animator. I've been in love with Walt and Roy Disney my entire life, and growing up in Southern California, Disneyland has always been such a focal point for the world. But when you live here, it's really ingrained in you. And when I was a kid, in the mid '70s, Walt was still on TV. So to me, Walt was still alive. But I didn't know that he had passed in 1966. I found out when I was 9 or 10 years old at Disneyland, actually.
Oh, wow.
But growing up wanting to make cartoons and drawing, probably when I was pushing high school age, and computers became like the big topic of conversation in entertainment, I had never seen a computer. So I stopped drawing and I stopped thinking of animation because I didn't think that they needed people to draw because they were always talking about this computers and computers and computers. So I went towards video instead in high school and took a couple of they're called ROP courses, Regional Occupational Program. And I was lucky enough to have a teacher, instructor, I guess he's not a real teacher, a licensed teacher, credentialed teacher. His name was Bob Carroll. And Bob was an engineer. And I took to him real well. And he took to me. So I learned television from him. And he was all over Southern California with news and whatnot. And I really enjoyed what he did. He produced a show out in the Inland Empire called Inland Valley Sports Scene Magazine, which we went and we covered prep sports. And so that's when I started running camera. And that was my first real gig as a television person, production person. So we did like football and baseball and basketball. And we did all this great stuff all throughout my high school. I never went to college. I've never stepped foot in a college classroom or a lecture hall or whatever they're called. And I flim-flam my way into television in Springfield, Missouri, right out of high school, really, in the early 90s. But I've done everything from news to documentaries to sports to wrestling, MMA, you name it. I've virtually been a part of it. Red carpet events for the Oscars and the Emmys. Boy, just tons of stuff.
When you broke into news,
wrapped up in there.
When you were breaking into news, were you strictly behind the scenes doing video? Because I know eventually you became an on-screen presenter, but was that later? Did that come later on?
Oh, it came way later. In news, when I got to Missouri, I just started shooting freelance for all the stations in town, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox back then. And then I moved into studio production and directing and producing news, and then ABC Sports and ABC News, ESPN. I directed a lot of NCAA 2 sports, basketball, volleyball, badminton, football, a lot of Southwest Missouri State University football and sports, because that was in Springfield, Missouri, where I was. Yeah, so it just went from there. But no, being on camera didn't happen really until I came back to California and in '99 and started doing wrestling out here. And the only reason why I was on camera was because I was editing the video packages and stuff like UPW, Ultimate Pro Wrestling, out here. And then I would do the voiceovers for things too, just because I was the guy editing and it was like 2:00 in the morning and someone had to do something. And then I ended up being on camera at that point. I never had the ambition to be on camera. I never thought I could be on camera. I did have news people tell me that I could be a reporter or an anchor if I wanted to, but I never really pursued that. Growing up, I stuttered, so I never felt that I had a good speaking voice. I corrected that by reading the newspaper out loud to myself every day, cover to cover, every page, and tried not to mess a word up and take my time and pronounce the words and that kind of stuff. So I was also in an ESL class in elementary school because growing up in my neighborhood where I grew up, it was all Hispanic. And I'm Puerto Rican, grew up in a Puerto Rican house, and their dialect was Spanish versus a Mexican dialect versus a Guatemalan dialect. Everybody speaks a Colombian, everybody speaks a different type of Spanish. So that really confused me, I guess, as a child. So I was in an ESL class for 2 years to correct my English, but I still had to stutter. And that probably didn't go away until 6th or 7th grade. But then, I just never had confidence in myself to do that. But that's how I ended up on TV and doing reports and doing stuff, mostly in wrestling. But since then, I've done news reports and filled in for people. And I for KDOC TV here in Los Angeles, I not only worked there, but I was also on camera as a host for them. So when they were out in the public, there's a good chance that I was the guy giving away the T-shirts or the concert tickets or what's your favorite Seinfeld episode. So I got into that much later in my career.
It's got to be the contest, right?
Gotta be. You really need you really need that cheater's koozie.
But no, that's really fascinating because from my perspective, again, I've known you for a little over a decade, known about you, and you're just such a natural. So I would never have guessed that you had such a struggle, first of all, with speaking in general, but then later on being on camera. Never would have guessed that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's the people I looked up to, so television, when I was growing up, it still was the electric hearth. It still was the thing in the living room that everybody was glued to. And I took to Walt Disney as a presenter, not just as a creator and producer, but as a presenter, him on his program. Whether it was Walt Disney Presents or The Wonderful World of Disney or The Wonderful World of Color, and seeing him as that host, that's kind of where I stole a lot of my mannerisms. And then in Southern California, we had Jerry Dunphy as an anchor, and then of course Peter Jennings on ABC News, and then the people I worked with in news and knew these people one-on-one, and so pulling and trying to grab bits and pieces from people, a little bit from Fred Rogers too, trying to be that genial type a host on television. So that's where I got my style of being a presenter on TV.
I can actually see. I've never ever thought of the Walt Disney comparisons because I didn't grow up with them, of course, but I've seen stuff and I can totally see the similarities now. That's super interesting. Pro wrestling. Were you a fan?
Pro wrestling. No, I absolutely hated pro wrestling growing up. That's the truth. And it wasn't because of it's fake or it's this or it's that. I just didn't have interest in it because I thought I was going to make cartoons. So I wasn't into sports either. I've always been a bit of a misfit, believe it or not. I know most people think of me as the square on TV with a microphone and for some reason a squeaky odd voice. I have a pretty deep voice, but a lot of people like to give me that nerd Poindexter, real high. Hi, how are you? I'm Dave Marquez type of a voice.
I know you love Todd Kenley's impression.
Man, that was the shits. Todd sounds more like that than I do. But you can go on and on and on and have people do impressions of me, and that's the impression they do. But no, I didn't care for wrestling, and I thought I was going to make cartoons. And I grew up around the Olympic Auditorium as a kid. And so, I started seeing more and more of it, started seeing the storytelling side of it, which is what attracted me into from the animation side is like, oh, these are characters, these are stories, figuring out the segments on TV during matches. There is a formula every week, whether it was the local Olympic Auditorium show or the WWF Championship Wrestling show. I started looking at it more from a technical standpoint than from an entertainment point of view. So that's what drew me in. It wasn't necessary. And Freddie Blassie, seeing Freddie Blassie, the wrestler in Los Angeles on LA TV, that was really cool. Like that was unique because you don't see people like that in LA. Like there's other types, but not like Fred Blassie and sharpening his teeth and calling people the names he called them and biting heads and all of that type of stuff. So
is there a rough time period attached to this? Like roughly what years?
Oh, it'd be the late 70s and early 80s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So from there, you started getting into it and you were intrigued by the storytelling aspect, I'm guessing you kind of already had a rough idea about the business. You weren't necessarily somebody who bought into everything by that point in your life.
Oh no, I wouldn't say that. No. It just didn't appeal to me. Again, my heroes growing up were Walt Disney and
Mhm.
and Fred Rogers, and they want you to be nice to people. It's so difficult for me at times too, to be very honest with you, Ken. I struggle with this to this day, that I present this type of violent storytelling on TV when everything I was ever taught growing up was, you don't. It's not an eye for an eye, and you don't go out there and fight somebody to settle your score and all that kind of stuff. It's I struggle with that daily. It's the truth.
I guess if there was an attachment then to a character, it would probably be somebody, who was kind of a quote unquote goody two shoes, who, if they did resort to fighting, it was for a just reason.
Yeah, but I like the bad guys. Who doesn't? Like
Yeah.
I mean, if there was one person I think that I could say that attracted me to wrestling was Roddy Piper.
Oh, wow.
Roddy Piper and Fred Blassie, those two, like, maniacal and mostly their words, not their actions. It's just what they said. And I didn't grow up around that type of uh, of, of, of vernacular, that type of vocabulary. And so hearing these guys on TV say this crazy stuff, like, that's what really, caught my attention. But like 1980, 83, 84, 85, going into Piper's Pit and all that. It's just like, hearing Roddy Piper say the stuff he said, and then be able to be friends with him later in life was just like crazy. Not from that fandom point of view, just the fact that I got to produce Roddy Piper. So, and he was saying my words.
Yeah, that's crazy. And
Yeah,
they just had such
cool.
magnetic charisma too. They had so much
Absolutely.
larger than life. Was there anybody you hated that you despised? Because I'm not sure completely what your fan level was, but we always have people that just grinded our gears as a kid. Was there somebody who you just couldn't stand for whatever reason?
No. I never looked at it. Again, I wasn't a fan of like who's winning and who's losing. It was just a show that was on, and there were all these characters. And like, I'm not a superhero person. I'm not a comic book person. I don't look at, like, I don't think I've ever really seen a Marvel or a DC film today. Even back then, like the Lou Ferrigno Incredible Hulk, I was never into that. Adam West Batman is different, I think, because it was so goofy and silly. 1966 Batman. So like, it just, I'm just not that type of person. I'm not an action film guy either. If you ask me Star Wars or Indiana Jones, I'd go more Indiana Jones because it's a little more historical and realistic. But yeah, no, there is no one that ever was like, boy, I hate that guy. This is the worst. Like, later in my career, like, watching and understanding the fundamentals of professional wrestling, and especially producing the television side of it, I understood Hulk Hogan's popularity and why he is who he is, and how gigantic he was. But then when you look at him, it's like, oh, he's not really a good wrestler.
Yeah.
So like, and I dare say I hated him. It's just like, if there was somebody who, if there was a Hulk Hogan match, I for sure would want the Big Boss Man to go over Hulk Hogan, then Hulk Hogan to win.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. So how did you transition from that kind of fandom to wanting? And maybe you didn't even want to be involved. Maybe you were pulled into it. How did you get involved?
It's really interesting. It's really interesting how I got into wrestling full time. I So I was directing and producing at a TV station in Springfield, Missouri, and the Bob Costas show was called Later. It's still on now. I think Seth Meyers hosted it. But back then it went off the air, and we had this time available. And so, the station was, what would you like to do? It's a college town. So, do you want to do a monster movie thing with like a ghoul, like what's his name, Svengoolie does today with the makeup, or an Elvira type show. And I blurted out, let's do a studio wrestling show. And I don't know why I said that, but I did. and we had the facilities to do it. And I said, okay, let's try it, and I did, and it ended up being World Legion Wrestling, and my partners were Harley Race and Gordon Solie, and then the station canceled the show, and I realized that I owned a pro wrestling company.
That's wild.
So it's really trippy how all that happened, and I'm very proud that WOW is still going today. Now it's called World League Wrestling in Missouri, and it's a trip that's still around, and people still enjoy what we started all those years ago. But that's how I got into it, and from that point on, luckily because of Harley and Gordon endorsing me, I had the opportunity to work for the WWF a lot, and WCW, and Corey Macklin's Memphis Wrestling, and there's a company for a while called Bad Boys of Wrestling, BBW. I think they're out of Oklahoma. And anyhow, I just learned a lot about how wrestling, the business side of it worked, and I really gravitated towards that. Being a promoter, being a producer, and then of course directing the television.
So we went to Missouri, and I am assuming it's because of the various other jobs you were doing. You're talking before about how you moved there. I'm guessing for news. Is that what brought you to Missouri originally, or?
Yeah, but it was bullshit. Like I had never worked at a TV station in my life. I lied, and got a job. And it was the best experience I can get could have received about telling the truth, because I got there and I had no idea what I was doing. There's live trucks, there's all the mechanisms to make a TV station work, and I didn't know what I was doing at all. Luckily, they had paid for me to get there, and so they weren't going to kick me out. Oh. and I was put in the master control, which is the brain of a TV station basically, and I was able to watch and learn and be a part of it, and then within months I ended up directing and producing. So, but yeah, I knew I knew enough to be in television, to be dangerous, as they say. Mm-hmm. And luckily I had an aptitude for it, and I took to it, and here I am 30 plus years later, still doing it.
It's crazy. I don't want to gloss over this though. You talked about working with Gordon Solie and Harley Race, and two of the most legendary names in wrestling ever. How did that actually come about? Like, how did you come in contact with them? Because I know you talked about the opening of the company and the TV slot, but how did you, from your position, get into contact with them and make that all happen?
It's real interesting. I was doing a news story at a mall in Springfield, Missouri. I think it was called the Battlefield Mall. It's probably still there. And there was a memorabilia shop, like movie star autographs and Betty Boop stuff and whatnot. And they were doing an event at the memorabilia shop, and they had wrestlers there. And one of the wrestlers under a mask ended up being Carl Lauer. Now, I'm not sure if you know of Carl. He just passed away about a year ago. He is probably most known for being the executive director of the Cauliflower Alley Club for many years. But at any rate, he portrayed himself as a character called Boss Man. And he was under a mask, and we did the report and all that stuff. We were cleaning up, and I remember Carl came to me, and we had LA roots because that's where he came from, and he was a promoter at the Olympic Auditorium with Red Bastien and a few others before the WWF took over the Olympic in the mid '80s, and then became what we know as the WWE today. Yeah. But Carl had a license, a promoter's license. And I hadn't made the pitch yet. Oh, this is probably all this is going to all tie together. So Carl had a promoter's license in Missouri, and he said to me if I ever wanted to get into wrestling, give him a ring. And when I pitched the station, let's do this, I guess I had Carl in mind because that's who I called to do the events. And since he was the executive vice president of the Cauliflower Alley Club, before we went on the air, he told me that I should probably go to a CAC event because I would meet people. And back then, it was all industry people. There was no one from the public allowed back then. We had who was it? Luthez was the president, and I believe Gordon was on the board of directors at the time. At any rate, I ended up going, and so Harley was there, but Gordon was there, and I remember being at the bar. Carl had introduced me and said, let's do this or let's do that, and this is David, whatever. And I remember talking to Gordon, who was a few vodka sodas in and more than a pack of cigarettes in. And
Sounds right.
He asked me on a cocktail napkin to sketch out. We were just talking. He was quizzing me. He goes, how do you see the TV arena looking? Why don't you draw out where the cameras would go? And where would the microphones go? And what would you do with this? And so I explained to them, this is what I do. This is I sketched it out. And he goes, that's perfect. And he bought me a drink.
Wow.
And so I said, I'm doing this show with Carl. And he goes, yes. And I said, I guess we need a commentator. Would you mind doing it? And he goes, I would be happy to do it. So I had my commentator, and who wouldn't want Gordon Solie? And then later on the next day, I believe, Harley was walking with maybe 24 long necks through the convention like this with just beer.
Oh.
And I stopped him because I knew Harley was in Missouri just like I was. He was in Kansas City. And so I told him what was going on, and I explained Carl and all this, and he was like, yes, yes, yes. And he didn't want to talk to me. And I said to him, well, would you please make an appearance for us? And he said to me, if you can get Gordon over there to do it, I'll do it. He didn't know that I already had Gordon.
Oh, wow. So that worked out pretty well for you. Then you're like, oh, perfect. Good news.
I was like, fantastic. And so that's how that started. And we were together for many years. I learned an awful lot what to and what not to do with Harley. And Gordon, on the other hand, he was failing in health and stuff, but he was a great sport throughout. But you can't get that type of education. Like, I was with them daily, whether they're on the telephone or in person, especially with Harley in person. I saw Harley all the time. And we worked a lot together. So a lot of my habits, luckily the bad habits I've got rid of. but years ago, if you talk to people who knew me then, I was kind of a different person just because of the education I got and what I thought wrestling and how to treat wrestlers. Not they were treated bad, but just all the stereotypical things you hear today about what a promoter would do to a talent. And I was taught to do that. And unfortunately, in the beginning, that's what we did. But here we are 20 plus years later, and we don't do that anymore.
Learning curve, and the world has changed. Wrestling has certainly changed, and you've seen a lot of that change. It's crazy, though. Just, I can't get over that mentorship is just, it's no wonder why you've had such a successful time since then. So how did it end? You mentioned something about losing the TV deal. How quickly did that happen?
No, we didn't lose the TV deal necessarily. I mean, on that channel, they didn't want it anymore. So I took the tapes across the street to the Fox station. We were running the tapes there, and we stayed on for a few years. And then we were on Harley's old All-Star Wrestling circuit, so the TVs were on in those areas, not just in Springfield. And that's how I learned syndication and sales. was doing that ourselves. Then there was a national network of low power TV stations, probably 200 stations, but people actually watch it because I talk to them to this day and they still talk about it. It was called America One, and like ECW was on there, we were on there. Music City Wrestling was on there. Maybe even Memphis was on there, but there was a lot of us on that channel at that time in the mid to late 90s. So we didn't lose it, and everything kind of ended in 1998, 99 for me. So I was freelancing for WCW, and we knew it was kind of the end there, and kind of the freelance work kind of dried up. And so I came back to California and back home, and I sold out my piece to Harley and BJ Race, and they kept it, and good for them because it's still here today.
Trained a lot of great wrestlers too.
Yeah.
So you said you were doing freelance work for WCW. What exactly were you doing, and how did that opportunity come about?
All Harley and Gordon, all of it. I mean, when they'd come to the area in Missouri, St. Louis, Kansas City, Springfield, Oklahoma City, maybe, or Tunica, Mississippi, I was allowed to go with them, and I just met people, and I did everything from, helping with the shows or camera operator, whatever they needed, really. I did. I would go to the WCW Saturday night tapings. I would go to WCW Worldwide at Walt Disney World, see how that was being put together, and I was just as needed. And I created a great relationship with Terry Taylor, which I still enjoy today. And he kind of became my new mentor, and still is. I still bounce things off him weekly. And yeah, same thing with the WWF, WWE. I freelanced for them, and when I came back to California in 1999, I worked for them through UPW. So, and ironically enough, Terry Taylor, when WCW closed and all that, came back to the WWF as well.
When you were doing the freelance work, were you hoping that would transition to a full-time role with the company, or were you still focused on away from wrestling activities?
I've always wanted to escape wrestling. I kind of got the golden handcuffs, So, to this day, you could ask anybody who works with me. I try to leave wrestling every second of the day. If I didn't have to sit here right now and sign checks, I'd be at home. I do complain about wrestling. I don't care for the all of the what would you call it? There are so many philosophies from people who are involved in wrestling, and especially where they've come from. Some people are very traditional in their wrestling training. So, whether you're some talents don't know they're being hurt by their trainer, not physically, but mentally. Mm-hmm. They get into the world of wrestling and don't know how to negotiate. They don't understand the business side of it because their trainers don't want them to know that, because usually when you're being trained in pro wrestling, it's to create a pool of talent that you can use virtually for free.
Yeah.
You're a student, so you're working for free. And then when they come into general population, like for a guy like me, they don't know how to talk to a real producer or a real promoter, and they never ask for money. And then it's like, well, here's money, and they're like, well, why am I getting this money? And then later on they resent the money and they want more money, which is fine, but it's never like a one-on-one. Well, this is business. Talk to me about what you need, and I'm sure you'll get it once you make your request. Like any job. So yeah, I don't know how I got onto that, but yeah, that's I'm not the biggest fan of pro wrestling.
It's fascinating though that you brought up that business aspect, because there's a infamous Kevin Nash quote that I love, which is everybody calls it the wrestling business until you start treating it like one. And there's always that line where it seems like there's people who aren't necessarily cut out for real world business, who enter wrestling. So when it comes to, having those discussions, they struggle with it. Is that something that you deal with as often today as you did 20 years ago, or has it gotten better, worse?
It's gotten worse. At least 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, the talents that are involved, they tasted money. They knew what wrestling could provide. And with the dilution, if that's the word, the diluting something or evaluating, deteriorating pro wrestling into what people consider indie wrestling today. I fucking hate the term indie wrestling, independent wrestling. I think it's one of the worst things that has happened to wrestling. It's brought the mentality down. The business end of it is not there. And the talent is like, they're just like cattle. It's just, they go to these classes, they learn how to fall, they sort of know how to put a match together. They're sold in their head on a character that doesn't work, and it's very difficult to get them to understand why it won't work. And they're not producible because somebody somewhere took their $3,000 to $5,000 for 6 weeks to a year and told them, "Yep, this is great. Go into the world and be in WrestleMania." So yeah, it's way worse today than it ever has been.
Do you think that the issue is there's too many people who are being broken in the wrong way, or too many people being broken in at all?
I think it's too many people being trained by individuals who have never done anything. So they've never made money. They don't know what it means to make money. They may have done extra work or job work, back like how we used to call it, with a WWE, and they might be a part of the casting when a SmackDown or Raw comes through, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they know what pro wrestling is. And then you have veteran wrestlers who have retired in open wrestling schools, and it's just kind of like a snake pit. They take the money, they give their philosophy, but they only give the students enough knowledge to go out and just be basic, because I don't think they want that to turn around on them, and they have to actually start paying them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You moved back to California. How did you transition into wrestling there? Like, how did you start putting on shows? Where did that happen?
Well, I didn't immediately start promoting when I came back. In fact, I didn't have a job when I came back, so I went back and worked for Disney. I went to Disneyland. I was in broadcast services and Cast TV, kind of a propaganda closed circuit channel for cast members throughout the Disneyland Resort, which is what was being built at the time. California Adventure was being built.
And this was like 99-ish, 2000 in that
99, 2000. And then I got a call from Terry Taylor, and he told me about Rick Bassman in Santa Ana, California, and his Ultimate Pro Wrestling, which was a developmental for the WWF at the time. And he told me they needed a video producer. So I went down, I talked to Rick at the Galaxy Theater, and I think the first person I met was Samoa Joe that day. He was the webmaster back then. And then I talked to Rick, and then we went downstairs, and I was put immediately to work. And I believe that night I shot practice promos with Tom Howard and John Cena. That night. Yeah, the Prototype. So that was my reintroduction into Southern California wrestling. And then I started attending shows, and it was a different vibe. And I watched Pro Wrestling Guerrilla in the beginning. I helped them as well, as they were getting started in the very beginning. But it came out of like Rev Pro, Ron Rivera's company, and it was this hybrid of lucha libre and pro wrestling, and it was completely different than anything that I knew of. So I kind of resented it. I enjoyed what was going on at UPW because it was more traditional, and I was dealing with the WWF office, so I dealt with Bruce Pritchard and Terry Taylor and Kevin Kelly at the time, and then Jim Ross. So, but yeah, so it was, and Jim Cornette too with OVW, because we had to, coordinate things and go back and forth with some of the talent. Jim Cornette hated everything I think we did at at UPW because he ended up with all the guys that we had, and he had to retrain them. So, but yeah, so that's how I got back in. But my real job was with Disney at the time.
There's some fascinating names you mentioned there. Bruce Pritchard, even Terry Taylor from earlier, Jim Cornette, because these are some of the most controversial names in wrestling, and I can only imagine the stories you've had working with them. How hands-on and how often did you work with like a Bruce Pritchard, for example?
Well, Rick Bassman dealt with him mostly. I would only have to deal with interact with him. I shouldn't say deal. That sounds so negative. I would have to interact with them when they came to the events to evaluate talent. One of my jobs was to put together evaluation tapes, and I would ship those off to Connecticut. I think once a month of people that we were submitting to be considered for contract talent. Like just say an Aaron Aguilera or whomever. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's how I would interact with them when they came to the Galaxy where we'd shoot the shows, and I'd be directing the TV. And John Cena used to call me an octopus because he so many arms and yelling and 4-letter words and all that stuff. He'd sit right behind me back then, and I'm not saying that helped him to where he's at today, but I think he understood television more by sitting over my shoulder.
I think it's safe to say David Marquez made John Cena. I think that's what we just established.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't go that far. But he does call me Diamond Dave, so I'll take that.
There you go. There you go. How much interaction did you have with Rick Bassman? I assume more because, for example, I talked to Yuma, and he trained there for, I don't know, maybe a year. And he only met him, I think, once, maybe twice, the entire time he was there. But that was also, a trainee, and you already talked about how, that's a whole different world right there. For you, dealing with production and everything you just mentioned, how hands-on were you with him, and how often did you work with him?
My desk was right next to his, so I saw Rick hourly.
Oh, wow.
Whether I wanted to or not. And we're still great friends today. I talk to Rick often.
What do you think about his influence on wrestling? Because I feel like sometimes he gets a bad rap because, again, you have like the Jim Cornettes who will talk about, he brings in these big bodybuilders who don't know anything about wrestling and can't work and get them signed. But I mean, Ultimate Warrior, Sting, John Cena, and then you talk about the Samoa Joes, and there's a lot of incredibly popular talent that came courtesy of him.
I think he got 30 people signed out of UPW.
Wow, 30.
To be honest, I think that's the number. And, the training wasn't the best. I mean, I'd admit that. But what Rick, and which is probably how I'm still doing what I'm doing today, Rick's side of it was the entertainment piece. Now, Rick was in direct communication with Vince McMahon. Mm-hmm. Like, Rick would tell us, Vince wants this, and we need to create a guy like this, and this is what they need to do. And so me optically, setting cameras up and angles and getting the guys to look at the cameras and interact with the cameras and understand the microphones and all that stuff. I think that's what Rick was really good at because he understood the show business side of it. Rick was also a Disney executive that many people don't know about at Walt Disney World. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and entertainment. So he would book bands, big bands too, not just like some fake Beatles impersonators. He actually had, let's say, Ringo Starr there. No, Rick's a very talented, and he has a Rolodex. Like, he dealt with Michael Eisner directly, so he knows how to work with those guys on top. But yeah, Rick's influence. It might not be as vocal, but people behind the scenes know who and what Rick Bassman is.
I appreciate that insight. Thank you. And I do want to fast forward a little bit to a company I'm really interested. I already told you I was really interested in hearing about Wrestling Society X. But before we get directly to that, I did want to ask, something came up when I was talking to, again, Johnny Yuma, most recent interview, so it's on my mind. I was thinking about how there's a lot of Southern California-ish projects that seem to have a lot of potential, but they ultimately end up fizzling out pretty quickly. You know, the longest running of the short-lived projects was Lucha Underground. But then you had WSX, you had Lucha Libre USA, you had all these various projects that they seemed like there was a lot of potential behind them, a lot of interest, and then it never really fizzled out. Why do you think that happens to the Southern California wrestling scene? Because you've been in business for so long there, but all these other places are kind of flash by night, even though they have a lot of hype going in.
Well, I know exactly why WSX didn't work. I could talk about that later.
Definitely.
But you know, when I had nothing to do with Lucha Underground or Lucha Libre USA, I think that was MTV, right?
Yeah.
MTV too, and that's probably the same thing with Wrestling Society X. So it could be the same reasons behind the scene, because it's Viacom. That's what our problem is, from my perspective. But I don't know. And when you mention Southern California, I don't think geography is what's to play here. I think it's the corporate side of who's financing it. We just happen to be in Southern California because that's where you make movies and television. So, but yeah, I don't have an answer because I wasn't there.
Mhm.
And I don't know the players. So I don't know if Robert Rodriguez was really in charge of what was happening at Lucha Underground, or even Mark Barnett, who I'm pretty sure MGM was financing some of that. And that's the problem. Like having a studio or a media company financing wrestling and not understanding the operation of pro wrestling. And I even saw it at TBS and Turner Broadcasting too when I was there. And even like talking to Steve Case, who was the chairman and CEO of AOL. You know, I sat down with him a few times, not at TBS, but after when I had met him about the wrestling side of it. And, you know, they just didn't understand what it was. So they just got rid of it. And I think that's the big piece all the way around. Everybody has the idea of what the WWE is, but they don't realize that it's Vince McMahon or now Triple H. You know, it's one person's vision. And even going back to, let's say, Disney, you know, it was one guy's idea. And post Disney, post Walt, 1966 to probably 1986, like the Walt Disney Company was in flux. It was a mess. So it took Michael Eisner, another visionary, to put what we know as the Walt Disney Company today. So I really think that, you know, not having that visionary figurehead person, and you're dealing with corporate media or a studio running a wrestling company, that's the beginning of the end immediately. So that's what I think.
On paper, like it would make a lot of sense for you have all these opportunities. Hollywood's right there, all the production and everything. The way you laid that out made a lot of sense, where it's going to be different management who might not necessarily know what's going on, and then people will have different ideas of what they want. That's
because I can tell you the people at Viacom didn't know what they had on MTV with us. So
that's what I want to get to. WSX, Wrestling Society X, short-lived, really made a lot of noise briefly because that was probably the height of my fandom. I'm 31, and I want to say this was 2007, 2006. In that period, I was probably 15, 16, so that was real height of my, you know, teenage fandom, and I was super intrigued by it, but it was gone almost as quickly as it came. How did you first get involved with it, and what were your overall impressions of the concept?
Well, I helped develop it. So Kevin Kleinrock and I have been friends for many years. He was my boss at XPW, which people are always shocked that I work there, but I did. I directed a lot of their stuff for about a year or two, while I also produced porn because that's what you had to do.
If we have time, I'd definitely love to get into XPW talk too, but I don't know.
Well, if we don't, folks could look at the Rob Black Dark Side of the Ring. I'm in that, and I talk about it there. Kevin had this idea, and I think the original concept of it was Black Label Society Wrestling with the band. And and then we'd be in like a speakeasy underground environment. And so Kevin and I shared an office at Big Vision Entertainment, where he was the vice president. Houston Curtis was the president, and he came from MTV as an executive producer and an executive at the network. And before that, he was with Funniest Videos and Vin DeBona Productions. And even before that, him and Rick Marr put out a Backyard Wrestling, the VHS and the video games. So they've always had this kind of grimy version of pro wrestling. And Kevin's interest was always like even lucha libre, how to make that more secular in the U.S. And today, if people know the name Kevin Kleinrock, he is the president of Masked Republic. So they're a big licensing and lucha libre management company. So a lot of the guys you'll see, like Dragon Lee, they represent him and stuff like that. So, but at any rate, we shared a desk, and we were doing championship wrestling already on paper. Kevin came up with this concept that he wanted to do this Black Label Society in Houston, I believe. Said, well, we have connections at MTV. Let's go pitch it. And they did. And so I was involved from day one, and helped the project along, and agreed and disagreed with a lot of it. And I was a producer on the program, an agent, if you want to call it that. And I am one of the co-creators of Mac Classic.
Oh, there you go. I didn't know that. Very cool. Mm-hmm. Speaking of Kevin Kleinrock, we will hopefully be having a chat with him in a few months. It's still on the planning stages, but just like you, he's had a very fascinating career.
It's all his fault. And when you talk to him, you can quote me and say, David Marquez says it's all your fault.
I will absolutely do that just for the soundbite. But did you automatically see the different hands changing what the concept was quickly? Was that something that happened? Because you talked about the Black Label Society wrestling, and it evolved.
Yeah. I think it's because they couldn't get the secure the band to front the show. And MTV, Viacom, owned a piece of the broadcast, and with Big Vision or Houston. And yeah, I mean, we would get notes from the network even before we were shooting, and then while we were shooting. I mean, so originally, for the pilot, I was the director, but the MTV executives didn't feel I had enough experience to be the director. So they brought in, I believe, a soap opera talk show game show director. And I sat behind him in the truck, and he would ask me, is this shot? Should I take that shot? And I was a little bitter, and I wasn't giving him good guidance. And so I was also then at that point producing the commentary talent. I was in their ear giving them lines. Not that Chris Kloss needed lines, but the other guys did. But yeah, we would get notes, and then, standards and practices would tell us that we can't use everyday items, even though WWE was doing it. So like brooms or buckets or chairs or even stop signs, which I thought was odd. It's like, well, who the hell can get their hands on a stop sign? But like we were being told what we could and couldn't do with weapons and that kind of stuff. And that was the gimmick of the show. It had good wrestling and good talent, but like everything else, we were told we couldn't do it.
That's crazy, and that's how much oversight you had.
Yeah, and so that, and the notes and the emails and conference calls and sitting with Kevin, who's coming up with creative with Vampiro. Yeah, it was a mess.
There were a lot of musical acts on the show. I believe everyone had one, and they would do guest commentary, and you brought that up, feeding lines. How was that whole situation? Because I feel like it could either be great depending on the person, or it could be a nightmare.
Yeah. I had an issue with everything because people were making fun of wrestling, and and at that point, I really respected pro wrestling. It was my bread and butter, so I had, you had to show it respect. And I'd hear crew members, lighting people. I yelled at a few of them a few times, and I got in trouble for it. I told them to shut the fuck up. This is what's paying your bills this week, and just keep your opinions to yourself.
And these are Viacom people and
well, they're freelance people,
freelance,
not necessarily people from the network, but lighting people, gaffers, electricians. They're just like talking about the guys in their panties and how this. It was.
But they weren't wrestling production people.
They were wrestling production people.
Oh, okay.
They were, but they weren't wrestling people. They were a part of the production.
Yeah.
And I didn't like the fans were fake. I mean, there were some real fans sprinkled in there, but all those fans were paid actors.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, that's why they were so pretty. Go back and look at it.
Now I'm gonna look and I'm gonna be like, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, everyone's really pretty in that crowd. Ryan Katz, who's now at the WWE, he was a big part of the show. He was the ring announcer, Fabian Kalin. Yeah. So I was producing him and in his ear, but he was also part of creative. He was at Big Vision. White
He's
Trash
another
Johnny
guy
Webb.
who I'm sorry to interrupt, but he was another guy who had a lot of, he was doing different companies in California and, before he went to WWE. What was your relationship like with him over the years?
Oh, Ryan and I are great friends. He was on this program for a long time too as GQ Money, my program, Championship Wrestling. He managed a lot of talent. I think at the end he was like a voodoo priest speaking in tongues.
I don't remember that one, but now I want to see it. Now I'm intrigued.
Yeah. Luchasaurus was actually one of his proteges back then on our program, with the lizard head off him. But yeah, no, Ryan's a great guy, and I actually saw him just at NXT about a month or two ago. So no, he's doing great.
And he's probably another one of those contacts, like you mentioned, Terry Taylor, where even to this day you can still, work together in that role.
Sure.
This is a bit off topic, and I want to get back to WSX in a minute, but because we brought up Ryan, I'm curious. What is your relationship generally with other independent companies? I know you don't like the independent wrestling wording, but other companies in the area, good and bad. Have you, as a promoter, a long-time promoter, found it difficult to work with a lot of them, or is it pretty easy because they come to you? How do you feel about that?
My door is always open. They might not like what I have to say about one thing or another, and many have their own philosophies. Everyone has their own fiefdoms, and whatnot. But I come from the NWA, so it's like I'm all about cooperation. And a lot of people don't need to be cooperative anymore. They have their own international network with YouTube and stuff like that. So you don't need to be in partners with anyone necessarily. But I don't have any problem with anyone necessarily in the operation of pro wrestling. There's some people I don't care for.
Yeah.
And it's vice versa in the country. But for the most part, I get along with everybody that I know of. But then there's always that other side of the coin that I might not know of. So
that's a good point.
But as far as I'm concerned, the door is wide open. As you can see, the door is open, and anyone's allowed to come in and talk. And I've consulted for a lot of people. Like just most recently, like coming out of the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic's still going, but coming out of lockdown, I directed and produced GCW, Impact, MLW, and stuff like that. So it's I think I have a great relationship with people. So
you have your hands in the fire pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, New Japan Strong, I help co-create with Rocky Romero. So it's like, you just have to ask them how they feel about it. But as far as I'm concerned, I have no issues with any of these guys. There's one or two though that if they were on fire, I'd add the more gas.
Back to WSX, the editing of the show I've always thought was interesting. You know, you had the over the top fireworks, you know, the 30-minute time slot, everything was moving, and the production was definitely unique. It was a unique production. How did you feel about that, and how much of that was your direction and, you know, Kevin's direction, and how much of it was, again, Viacom putting their fingers into things?
I think it was all Viacom. I had no say in it. It was edited at Technicolor in Burbank, with notes from MTV, and Kevin was supervising all of that. I remember Kevin called me down one night, probably at 2 or 3 in the morning, and they had an issue with an episode, and I helped them fix it. But it was not. I remember it being a horrible experience. All of WSX was horrible. I'm probably one of the only people you'll meet who was on that show that will talk negatively about it. I hated it.
It's a shame, but I can definitely see why, because, again, just when you were talking about, you know, you were taken out of your role for a lack of experience, and then they put someone else with no wrestling experience into the role.
Yeah. And it wasn't just that, you know. I mean, at that point, when we started doing the series and we moved over to the Desilu Studios, when we shot it, it was it was a different vibe at that point. You know, it's because now we're in this Hollywood environment. They're shooting Monk, the show, right next to us, and here we are wrestling, and so it was a different environment at that point. I knew we weren't doing traditional pro wrestling, but I also felt that the network and the people involved on an executive level above us didn't care about us, and then ultimately they didn't, because, you know, they burned all the shows, and then they put us opposite the new ECW, David Lagana's ECW. So it wasn't planned out. I thought it was doomed from the beginning, and we were promised a second season, and we never did it.
Did they give a specific reason? Because I feel like it was one of those declining ratings, even though they didn't necessarily promote you guys the right way. Was that
It had
an
nothing
excuse?
to do with ratings. It had nothing to do with ratings. I heard a couple of reasons, but none of them I can't qualify, so I'm not going to say them. I do know that they did think that, you know, Vampiro, they threw a fireball at him. I think it was Ricky Banderas, and it was a bit much, and it did legitimately burn Ian Vampiro. And I was told that, you know, the show might be too violent, which if that was the case, we could have certainly toned it down for the second season. But we always had network people there when we shot the show. Like, everybody saw what we were doing.
So the excuses kind of came later, basically.
Well, yeah, there was a management shift at MTV at that time. If you remember, they went from male-oriented programming with us and a couple other shows into more of the quinceañeras and Sweet 16 and Pimp My Ride and This Is My House, and like the whole network changed its vibe.
Yeah, that's a dramatic shift. I can see where that kind of left you in no man's land.
Yeah.
All right. There's no way we're going to cover nearly everything today. I appreciate your time so much. We should, as much as I want to talk about XPW and NWA, maybe I'll be fortunate for a second interview one day.
Hit the NWA. I'm not in a hurry. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I definitely want to talk about
you could skip XPW, but go to the NWA. I'd be happy to talk about that.
Because the NWA, the whole situation is fascinating, because you had such a relationship with them in various ways for so long. How did you first get in touch with the NWA, and what was it like at that time?
I mean, when we started WLW, Harley and Gordon, Gordon Solie pushed me to join the NWA. So he introduced me to Howard Brody, who passed, unfortunately, last year. He was the president of the NWA at the time. And I had to buy the Missouri territory from also the late Ed Schumann out of Chicago for $500. And and I was the promoter in Missouri for a while. And it was on again, off again as a member. when I left Missouri, Harley decided he didn't want to be a part of it anymore. Him and Howard had a disagreement, and so Howard kicked WLW out of the NWA. And when I came back to California, um, and started up with New Japan Pro Wrestling, I felt that the New Japan name wasn't strong enough in the U.S. To do anything. And Antonio Inoki was the NWA member in Japan, even though 01 was using it. I was the vice president of New Japan USA. And so I used the proxy towards my advantage to try to get the LA dojo over. And it was all about votes. And then California became available. And so then I personally, David Marquez, became the promoter in California, while New Japan was the Japanese member. And so I had 2 votes.
There's so much to dive into, and there's so much fascinating stuff between the Japan and the LA dojo. Just dial back, though, with the NWA, what was it actually, like, as a member in the vote, what was the role? Because you think back to the NWA, the classic NWA, right? And, you had the get-togethers where they would talk about who's in, who's out, who's the champion, who's not. How was that different in 99, 2000?
It wasn't.
Really, it was the same.
It was exactly the same. And I started going to the NWA meetings, I think, in 94.
Wow, that early.
Or 95. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. So from there, you had the New Japan. How did that relationship begin?
Rick Bassman. Rick Bassman brought me in to speak to Simon Inoki for something, and the dojo was already up and running. Justin McCauley was in charge of the training of his brother Sean. Both ended up being in UFC later. I can't remember why Rick took me in. I was in there for something, and Simon Inoki took to me and called me on my way home and asked if I could go back to the dojo, and I did. And we talked, and he hired me as the director of new business as a freelance role, because I was still working at Disney at the time. And I was in Orange County, and they were in Santa Monica.
So what did that role entail?
I was just to be able to use my Rolodex and create business opportunities for New Japan. So at the time, my first big deal I did was the Eddie Guerrero DVD. And they had New Japan matches on the DVD. So I negotiated that deal. And then a couple other TV licensing representing TV Asahi and New Japan with the WWE. I think the guy's name was Tom Baraka, I want to say, who I dealt with at the WWE studios, or the library back then, or the archive. And then from the NWA point of view, when I got back into that, I was the liaison between Jerry Jarrett, TNA, and the NWA and New Japan. So when you started seeing the New Japan talent on TNA back then, that was me who initiated that stuff. And then I was a recruiter too. So I brought everybody from Carl Anderson to Finn Balor to tons of Australians, Alex Kozlov. The list goes on and on. I don't want to miss anybody. On and on and on and on of all the talents that I brought together at the LA Dojo. And they are all virtually what makes up network corporate pro wrestling today.
Yeah. I say this with all due respect. You are in many ways the Forrest Gump of wrestling. If there's something happening, you have your hands in it somewhere. You're there for it.
I guess, yeah.
But again, I mean, with all the respect in the world, but
no, it's fine. That movie didn't make any money either, so I get it.
Okay, so with the NWA, actually, no, I want to go back to the Japan because I'm just so interested. Do you know what their goal was at that time? Because obviously you've seen the U.S. expansion more in the last, 5 years or however long, and the COVID pandemic messed a lot of that up. Do you know what their goal was at that time for U.S. expansion?
Yeah. I mean, they just wanted to be respected here. They felt, the Japanese felt, that the New Japan brand at that time, 30 years or whatever, they felt, and Mr. Inoki felt, that the brand means something and is popular enough. And as much as I tried to explain to them that people in the U.S. didn't care about New Japan Pro Wrestling, they never bought it. So when I added the NWA name to it, we were doing arenas. We were doing big shows, and because the NWA did mean something to the right people.
Mm-hmm.
So and today it's the same thing, and they're in the same problems that they were in when I was there. The strong program is now gone. They're not going to produce that anymore. And I just saw recently an advertisement for the New Japan USA Academy. So again, I'm speaking way out of turn. I'm not there, but I just an outsider who knows a little bit looking in. I feel that funding is being cut for them, and they basically told them to figure it out. And so now they're opening a pro wrestling school to keep the USA operation open. Now that may be a drastic statement.
Yeah.
But just based on my experience with them, I was told the same thing. And we moved from Santa Monica over to North Hollywood, and I moved the dojo into a strip club. Nobody was watching. And Simon Inoki, I had direct contact with, and he was the president of New Japan. So it's like, I don't know. It's that's its own book. New Japan Pro Wrestling in America.
Do you think there's a way to make it work? Like, or do you think it's just something that would just can't translate?
I don't know. The New Japan office specifically, and my dealings with them, they are so traditional. Even recently, as everybody knows, this is a show. Everybody knows that the public knows what we do. Mm-hmm. But even with the New Japan side of it, like I had an issue at an event I was producing for them. I had to go into the locker room, and there were seconds outside not letting me through the door, even though I knew everybody in there. It took Jushin Liger to recognize me to let me in the door.
And this was what, in the 2000s?
This was a couple of years ago.
Jeez.
We did a show at the Long Beach Pyramid. I don't remember the name of it, but I produced that.
Wow.
And I was taking a TV monitor in for them to set it up so they can watch the show in the locker room. And they weren't letting me in because I wasn't one of the wrestlers in their mind. The show we did at the LA Coliseum right after the pandemic, I produced that. And they made us leave the ringside area because of kayfabe, and I knew everybody in the ring. Like and we're setting cameras up, and so their way of doing things from a traditional Japanese standpoint. That's what I believe holds them back in America.
Super interesting. Super interesting. With the NWA. And I feel like we can't necessarily keep talking about the NWA without getting to the beginning of Championship Wrestling. How did Championship Wrestling from Hollywood officially start, and how did the NWA business relationship affect that?
Well, I was producing a regional show. Called NWA Pro Wrestling, and we were just doing it was on a network called MAV TV, and I went to an NWA meeting in some southern town, and we were all talking about what we were doing and how we were doing it and whatever. TNA was, of course, already on the air. And I remember Bill Behrens telling me that because Bill's background before wrestling was he was a TV syndicator, I think for Universal. So he knew TV stations well. That he told me to my face that nobody would care about local wrestling on their TV stations.
Oh wow!
And I disagreed. So at that point, being in Los Angeles, the number 2 market in America, I was like, well, I'll show him. And Kevin Kleinrock and I had a meeting with KTLA here in Los Angeles, Channel 5, a legacy station, and the management there. They agreed to put the show on the air. And just to cut to the chase, we shot the shows, great shows, and they never aired because KTLA was a part of Tribune Broadcasting, and they went into bankruptcy.
Oh.
And so they couldn't take the show. So I drove the tapes down the 5 freeway, kind of where we're at right now, and to KDOC TV, and they took it. And we enjoyed 14 and a half years with them.
That's
the only reason why we're not on the air anymore is because the station was sold to a Christian broadcasting channel, and they took the general entertainment off. And I lost another job because I was a producer and director there up until July 30th.
That's another thing about you. You have so many jobs. I respect it. I respect how many different jobs you have.
Well, you have to. I mean, this does well. Wrestling does well for all of us, but it doesn't pay for health insurance. It doesn't,
Plus, if you have all your, everything in one basket, if something happens, then you're out of luck.
Yeah.
The way you do it, you always have alternatives and you can pivot.
That's right.
So that transitioned to the championship wrestling from Hollywood properly?
Yeah. So then we started NWA Championship Wrestling. And then when we lost the organization to Bruce Tharp, I want to say in 2012, I just changed it to Championship Wrestling from Hollywood. And then I created the United Wrestling Network to be kind of like an NWA-esque sanctioning body for all my NWA friends who we thought we all should stay together, but nobody wanted to do it.
And that's stuff I want to get into, because your vision for almost having like a recreated territory system, I'm so intrigued by it, because another big name in wrestling, Triple H, he has a very similar vision with the NXT product. He, not necessarily in the United States, but globally, he wants to have NXT India, NXT Europe, NXT Japan, where you're kind of building up these different talents. You can move people across the board, and you have your own TV in that localized area. What was it, just because of your upbringing that made that idea interesting to you? And what were the difficulties? You just mentioned one of them, with people not necessarily getting involved, but
well, it's just, again, promoters today, they don't need a cooperation, and they don't need to work with each other. If they want to make local TV, they can. They have TikTok, they have YouTube, they have other avenues. But to me, that never made any money. I couldn't see how to make money with that. I understood broadcasting. So I used the TV model and commercials to make money. And people didn't understand that because they were younger people. And they feel that local television is dead when it's not dead at all. So, that this is what, hang on a second. Let me finish this. Thank you. Yeah. And that's what being a producer is. So as I was saying, I understood broadcasting. And within broadcasting, the commercials is what pays for the bills. And these beautiful people being here. So that's part of the struggle with what I do, not just here in the facility, but with other promoters and other people. So people just don't feel that they need to work together. I always felt you had to work together, no matter if it's like we have today. We have AEW that we work with monthly. We have a great relationship with Impact. We have a great relationship still with New Japan. Even what I just said about them, I'm sure people there will understand why I said it. And internationally, we have a fantastic relationship with everybody everywhere.
You've been great. I really appreciate all the time you've given me. We just cover a few more things with the NWA. You talked about Bruce Tharp. How did that whole situation go? Because again, the NWA's, they've had so many ups and downs. There's been so many the shifts in management and ownership, and eventually Billy Corgan. So from Bruce Tharp and then later onward to the Billy Corgan era, how were you dealing with that, and what was your role with that?
Well, the Bruce Tharp side, I was a vice president. I was on the board of directors. I knew Bruce prior to that. I really believe that Bruce felt he had a better idea of what to do with the NWA. I had a call before the coup happened. I disagreed with what he asked me to do. And so I was on the most wanted list and America's most hated list within the NWA. And then Bruce sued us to get the organization. Ultimately, I feel it was greed at the end of the day. And, he ran it. I hope he had a good time with it. Then he couldn't sustain it anymore. And when Billy Corgan and David Lagana left Impact, they came to me to try to do something. And I didn't feel that Championship Wrestling would work within the ideas that they presented. And I told them that the NWA was available because I heard it was for sale. And I gave them all the roadmaps of where to go and how to find all the bodies. And they came up with terms, and Billy Corgan bought it.
What was the coup that you talked about with Bruce Tharps? If you feel comfortable talking about it.
Oh, it's all public. I mean, he sued us. He felt that I don't know if it was non-confidence. Originally, it was an insurance claim or insurance fraud is what started it. His excuse or claim. He's a lawyer. I don't know if a lot of people know that. He's a lawyer. And he went with it fully and froze our money, and we couldn't fight and this and that. And it just wasn't worth it anymore. And he got it.
All that just to have ownership of it instead of sharing, like.
Yeah, well, he had an idea. He had his idea.
Mm-hmm.
And he went with it, and it lasted a few years.
Fast forward, you talked about Billy Corgan, how you helped him basically navigate the purchase. You worked with Billy Corgan for quite some time with the National Wrestling Alliance. You're an on-screen figure and highly entertaining there. What were your thoughts on the Lightning One era, especially early on with Power when it first came onto television or YouTube, and just the overall product and the presentation?
Well, the NWA Lightning One side of it, it all happened when they visited me one February when they left Impact, David Lagana and Billy Corgan. And they visited me at Championship Wrestling. They presented what they thought they wanted to do. I let them know the NWA was for sale. And then we started producing the 10 Pounds of Gold series. And after that, we went into Power. And we were producing all the NWA Lightning One content out of our facility at Championship Wrestling. So when you go back and look at all that older stuff, it was all shot by us. And when I got them into Georgia Public Television to shoot the Power program, I was originally going to direct the show. And then Corrigan and Lagana came to me and asked if I would be the interviewer, which I didn't want to do. And so the person I had directing my show at the time, Billy Trask, I put him in as the director with David producing. And then I started doing the interviews, and Jim Cornette was on commentary with Joe Galley, who also came from Championship Wrestling.
Yeah. What were your impressions, though? Because it was old school, of course, and I can see some similarities with how Championship Wrestling was produced, but of course it was different too. Did you see a lot of potential there? Because I know obviously you eventually had a split, and you can talk about it. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, how the split came about, but did you have a lot of faith in the product?
Oh, of course I did. I have a lot of faith in David Lagana to this day. David was the heartbeat of that show. And I knew that he was trying to reformat a broadcast version of the show to work on the internet. So when you watch it, it's cut very quickly. The segments are very tight, and it's not even like 42 minutes. It's probably really closer to 35, 38 minutes of content versus what we would do to make an hour program in broadcast television. No, I knew it was going to work.
What led to your exit, or at least from an on-screen perspective? I don't even know if you have any kind of relationship behind the scenes anymore at this point.
No, I don't speak to anybody in management there per se for business reasons. Kyle Davis, Billy Trask, and Joe Galley are great friends of mine. And we talk socially, but we don't talk about business. I don't know. The NWA to me right now is kind of like we don't talk about Bruno. So I found out I wasn't invited back after we produced a series called Primetime Live, a pay-per-view during the pandemic together. And I found out from Aaron Stevens, who was the head writer on this program at the time. He came to me and said, "Hey, are you going to be in Atlanta on whatever the date was?" And I said, "No, I didn't know about it." And then the fans started talking about it on Twitter because they were using me in promo packages. And I just made a statement and says, I have not been invited back. And so to this day, I don't know the true reason why I was fired or not invited back. But I wasn't, and I'm not there anymore. So I don't have a real reason why. Nick Aldis and I did not necessarily get along towards the end either. I took him to China as the world champion, of course, to get the Lightning One era started and put him on a big pedestal in front of an international crowd. But I don't know. Once David Lagana was gone, I think that was my in. And then when Lagana was no longer there, that was my out. So, yeah, I've not spoke to Corrigan about this or Pat Kenny or anybody. And I've helped them since too, by the way, to try to get some business stuff done. But I don't know if they ever followed through with it.
Hey, at least you're still willing to be helpful, though. That speaks a lot to your character.
Well, that's business. You know, if there's something that's good for all of us and there's a dollar to be made, you absolutely say yes.
Makes sense. Before we get plugs one more time and I'll let you go and thank you for your time, what is the future of championship wrestling and what is the future for you personally in pro wrestling?
Well, I think the future of championship wrestling, I hope presented by CarShield still, is you know, we're going to still swim along. We're on 180 plus TV stations, maybe 190 stations across the country right now. My business model is different from everybody else. We're all advertising supported, and we don't have a network paying us. We don't have a studio paying us. We don't have a media company paying us. Outside of the WOW Women's Show, we're the only other syndicated wrestling program on broadcast TV. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to continue doing that, continue putting these out. Memphis wrestling will continue. Our new Derby City wrestling will continue. I don't have plans to start local wrestling again and all these things like I did in the past. The thing in Louisville just happened. It was a fluke. A request was made. So we're going to make it go and see how far we go with it. We tried it in Atlanta a year or so ago. That didn't work out the way that we wanted it to, mostly internally, why it didn't happen. But yeah, that's the future, is to continue this, and that these fellas back here, you know, and girls, ladies, they're the future of this. My future in this, I'm hoping personally to be out of this within the next 2 years. That's my plan.
Oh, wow.
Of day-to-day wrestling activity. Not David Marquez Productions, because we do other things, but the wrestling side of it. Peter Avalon is the head of creative for all of the United Wrestling Network. A lot of people don't know that, but he is. Sean Phillips is basically my understudy here at the office, and he has my proxy. Logan Chedwigan is our director. He's the guy I yelled at who said for me to be quiet, and I told him to be quiet. That was my cue because of timing here, because they do have a show to produce. You know, Daniel Hill is a writer on this program. Gilbert Corsi is my partner in Louisville. Maria and Dustin Starr, my partners in Memphis. And, you know, I really hope that all develops and really gets out there. You know, and there's other people as well. Steve Bash is my right-hand man business partner in David Marquez Productions. And, you know, we got a lot of others who work tirelessly on this program. I shouldn't say effortlessly, because there's a lot of effort that's put into this each and every week. But that's the future. That's my future. I hope to be Howard Hughes here soon and be hiding out somewhere, me and my dog and who knows what else.
Just take a hands-off approach and let the people you put into place run things. Makes sense.
Yeah. It was Nick Bonanno. This was all being built for Nick Bonanno, but now he's a big shot in NXT.
I didn't even know that. There you go. There you go, right there. One more time, hit the plug so people know where to check you out and what people should be checking out.
You can find me at Championship Wrestling at CWFH Hollywood, or myself at CWFH Marquez. The websites are what they are. And again, if you follow me personally, I'm me on there. I'm not a character. So you're going to find my real impression on what I feel about life sometimes, and you may not agree with it.
And once again, we will have links in the description to the website, personal social media, all that. Be sure to follow us at Armbars Sidebar on Twitter, Armbars and Sidebars on Instagram, and at Armbars and Sidebars on YouTube. Subscribe if you haven't already. Like these videos. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having us, and thanks everyone for the support of this series for the last 15 years. And we hope to do some fun stuff. So I'm going to get these guys going again.
All right. Thank you so much again, guys. Until next time. Later.